Okay, so you're here because, let's face it, you want to get smart and you want to do it quick, right? You want the good stuff, the little fascinating stuff. And honestly, you've come to the right place. We're diving deep today into this. Honestly, it's a kind of unsettling stack of documents that you sent our way. And there's this one name that keeps popping up, John P. Nichols.
Yeah, you've got quite the collection here. I mean, it paints a picture of this guy, Nichols, but it's a picture full of shadows, A lot of mystery. What we're going to try and do today is unpack it all. What do these documents actually tell us about this guy? His supposed CIA connections, his role with the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, and all the controversy that seemed to follow him everywhere.
All right, so let's kick things off with something that really caught my eye. 1980, Saudi Arabia, and a pretty audacious scheme. So Dr. Nichols gets his hands on the blueprints to Crown Prince Fahd's palace in Taif, and he pitches a security plan. But here's the kicker. This whole thing triggers a background check into the Cabazon Band, and it seems like the Saudis are the ones pulling the strings. What's the deal with that?
Well, the really interesting thing is the specifics of what the Saudis wanted to know. We've got this letter here from Mohammed Jamil Hashem. He was the consul at the Royal Embassy of Saudi Arabia back then, and it's addressed to former Senator James Oborsk. And in this letter, he straight up confirms that neither the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, their trading company, nor Wackenhut International had any Jewish links. They checked their blacklist and gave them the all clear. Now, why would that be the main concern in a security proposal background check? It's a very specific and kind of strange detail to focus on.
Right. You got to wonder how a tribal entity like this, seemingly out of nowhere, ends up involved in international security consulting at this level. I mean, what was the connection that put them on the Saudi royal family's radar in the first place?
Right, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Why would the Saudis even be considering this relatively unknown tribal band for something as sensitive as palace security? And that explicit mention of Jewish links, it hints at something deeper, like maybe there were geopolitical tensions we're not fully aware of, or even just plain old prejudices at play back then. It definitely suggests some connections were happening way outside the usual diplomatic channels.
Okay, so this brings us to another fascinating layer of this whole story, the Cabazon arms trade and Wackenhut's involvement. The documents show that back in '79, Nichols recruits this guy Peter Zakowski. He used to be the president of Armtech, which was an arms manufacturer, and Nichols brings him in to plan a munitions plant right there on the Cabazon reservation. And get this. By 1983, the Cabazon Band actually gets Defense Department clearance to manufacture munitions. That's not a small thing. It means the U.S. government is basically saying, yeah, we trust a facility on tribal land to handle sensitive military production.
And it doesn't stop there. Nichols then tries to get LaFrance Specialties involved to build this weapons plant. But the real game changer seems to be the partnership that forms between Wackenhut International, which, as we see in one of your sources, was a private security firm with some pretty interesting characters connected to intelligence agencies, and the Cabazon Indians. And what was their goal? Well, it seems they wanted to produce high-tech weapons and explosives for export. The idea being that they could bypass those congressional restrictions on shipping weapons to certain groups, like the Contras, and some countries in the Middle East.
It's mind-blowing when you look at the types of weapons Nichols was proposing to manufacture. We're talking serious firepower. 120-millimeter combustible cartridge cases, that's artillery ammo, along with 9-millimeter machine pistols, assault weapons with laser sights, sniper rifles, even portable rocket systems. And there's one source that mentions, and this is chilling, that he even looked into developing biological weapons, and like you said, he managed to snag a secret facility clearance from the Department of Defense for the reservation. So what does all of this tell us about Nichols? Military contracts, international arms dealing, and all of it happening through a Native American tribe. It's way beyond what you'd expect from a tribal administrator. What kind of influence did this guy have?
It's a huge question, isn't it? The fact that he got that Defense Department clearance, the sheer sophistication of the weapons they were considering, this isn't your typical tribal activity. It suggests some very powerful connections, maybe even clandestine ones. Or maybe he was exploiting the reservation's sovereign status, to do things that would raise way more eyebrows anywhere else. And then you add Wackenhut to the mix, with their own rumored ties to former intelligence folks. It's a recipe for intrigue, a network operating in the shadows.
So this naturally leads us to the part of this story that's both captivating and incredibly murky. The allegations about Nichols' CIA connections. The sources mention that he himself claimed to be affiliated with the CIA, particularly during the Octopus murders investigation. It's a name that just screams conspiracy and hidden secrets.
Yeah, and what's particularly striking is what we see in Wikispooks. According to them, Nichols actually claimed to have been involved in some historically huge and sensitive covert ops. The assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile, and an attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro in Cuba. Now, these are major events in 20th century history. For Nichols to even claim involvement, even if we can't verify it from these documents, it tells us something about the image he was trying to project, or maybe the world he was really a part of.
Right. And it's not just him bragging. We have a source here, Spy Magazine, and they mention confidential correspondence that points to Nichols having extensive contacts in the world of spies, operatives, and government officials. And then there's our Wellness, who knew Nichols personally. He said Nichols always had money, but where and how he got it was always a mystery. So you've got this constant access to funds, coupled with these alleged connections to the shadowy world of intelligence. It definitely fuels the speculation, doesn't it? And we can't forget about his successful tax-free cigarette mail-order business and how California tried to sue him for tax evasion but failed. It paints a picture of someone who was really good at operating outside the normal rules.
Yeah, you could see that cigarette business as an early example of him using the reservation's special status to his advantage, maybe honing the skills he'd later use for bigger, riskier, and potentially illegal ventures. But let's be real, the heart of this whole discussion is whether Nichols' CIA claims hold any water. We don't have a smoking gun in these documents, no official statement saying John P. Nichols, CIA asset. But you've got all these connections, his claims of being involved in major covert actions. It paints a compelling picture, even if it's not definitively confirmed.
And things take a seriously dark turn when we start looking into the octopus murders and the alleged organized crime ties. Early 1981, Fred Alvarez, the tribal vice president, raises concerns about casino skimming. Seems like a local issue, right?
Yeah.
But it spirals into something way more sinister and deadly.
That's right. From what we can piece together, Nichols, who, by the way, was said to have long-established ties to organized crime, allegedly confessed to ordering the hit on Alvarez and others. And the investigations that followed, as detailed in these sources, connected these murders to this incredibly complex network. Organized crime figures, the arms trafficking operations we talked about, Wackenhut's role in all of this, even the modification and distribution of stolen software, potentially with government backing. And the fact that the FBI got involved because the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs ticked them off, well, it tells you how serious these allegations were. It suggests real concern at a high level.
And those organized crime links become even more concrete when you factor in Jimmy Hughes. He was identified as a mafia hitman, and he becomes the security director of the tribe's casino right after Alvarez is killed. And he stays in that position until 1984.
We're not talking about rumors here. It looks like known criminals were directly inserted into the tribe's power structure. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Appointing a suspected mafia hitman to a key security role. It tells you a lot about the situation at Cabazon back then. Like, there was a sense of comfort, maybe even dependence on these criminal networks to maintain control or run their operations. The octopus murders, it paints a really disturbing picture. Tribal governance, international arms deals, and organized crime all mixed up with fatal consequences for anyone who dared to question the status quo.
Even after things at Cabazon start to unravel, Nichols continues to be involved in criminal activity. In 85, he tries to hire a hitman again, but this time it's personal. He wants to take out the drug dealers who are supplying his girlfriend with heroin. He offers a measly $500 and a vague promise of future work in Vegas or South America. It almost feels desperate.
Right, and this is what leads to his guilty plea and 18 months in prison. It's a dark reminder that no matter what his alleged intelligence connections were, no matter what high-level covert stuff he might have been involved in, Nichols was also a regular criminal, capable of violence for personal reasons. It just adds another layer to this puzzle of a man.
And, it's really crucial to emphasize that while these sources are packed with claims, accusations, and circumstantial evidence that point towards involvement with clandestine activities and maybe even intelligence networks, we haven't found anything in this collection that definitively confirms Nichols was officially employed by the CIA or was a registered asset. It's like there's all this smoke, and it's hard not to think there's a fire somewhere, but based solely on these documents, we don't have that irrefutable proof.
You're absolutely right. What we're dealing with here are reported claims, testimonies from people who knew him, and a pattern of activities that certainly aligns with the world of covert ops and intelligence gathering. But we don't have any official documents from the CIA or other agencies that say, John P. Nichols, CIA. So there's room for interpretation, and we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Now, to give everyone a bit more context, some of your sources also focus on the regulation of Indian gaming, particularly from the perspective of this 1993 testimony about the implementation of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Why don't you walk us through that?
Sure. So what's interesting here is that we get a glimpse into how the legal and regulatory landscape around Indian gaming was developing in the years after what went down at Cabazon. This testimony outlines the different classes of gaming, Class 2 and Class 3, and the specific rules that applied to each, involving the National Indian Gaming Commission and those tribal state agreements called compacts. We also get some sense of scale. Back in '92, Indian gaming was actually a pretty small part of the total gambling revenue in the U.S., like 4.6%, especially compared to places like Nevada and Atlantic City.
And importantly, the testimony talks about concerns about organized crime infiltrating Indian gaming operations. That definitely echoes some of what we've seen with Nichols and Cabazon. But it's worth noting that the Department of Justice back then believed that, overall, major crime syndicates hadn't been successful in taking over these operations. So while Nichols and Cabazon might have been caught up with organized crime, it doesn't necessarily mean that was the norm for all of Indian gaming.
Exactly. Those regulatory efforts that were being talked about in '93, they represent an attempt to create structure and oversight for Indian gaming. Maybe it was partly a response to earlier controversies like what happened at Cabazon and a growing awareness that these operations could be vulnerable to exploitation and criminal influence. It's the bigger picture against which we have to view John P. Nichols and the Cabazon Band.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. What can we say about John P. Nichols? Well, based on these sources, the picture that emerges is undeniably complex and controversial. We've explored those alleged CIA ties, his pivotal role in that ambitious and likely illegal arms operation with Wackenhut on the Cabazon Reservation, the constant presence of organized crime, and of course the tragic octopus murders.
It's a wild story, isn't it? In the end, the information you've brought together paints a portrait of a man who navigated a really dangerous and fascinating world. Tribal sovereignty, international intrigue, suspected criminal activity, all playing out against a backdrop of changing regulations and anxieties about who was pulling the strings and who was being exploited.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. Looking at this web of relationships and events, it really makes you think about how blurred the lines were between government intelligence, private business, and even organized crime during that time. What questions do you think this deep dive leaves us with about covert operations and the impact they have? It's not always cut and dry, is it?
I think it makes you wonder about how sovereign entities like these Native American tribes could get caught up, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, in these shadowy worlds. And what are the long-term consequences of that for how they govern themselves and for their future? It's something to think about.
No doubt. We definitely encourage everyone listening to go back to those source materials, dig into the historical context, and draw their own conclusions. There are layers to uncover here and probably more stories to be told. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.